I would love it if everyone would turn on their screen just for a minute so we can get a picture. Even if you're in the car, it's okay. I'm still seeing people not there.
Maybe they're in a dark room. A friend sent me a Facebook post the other day, and it was Amish Christmas lights. And I thought, it didn't work. It's just black. And then I got the joke. Get it? Some people are in a room with Amish Christmas lights.
Okay, thank you all. I did get a picture. I want to welcome everyone this afternoon on this at least beautifully sunny day, even if it's cold. And we're going to have a great discussion today about 1950s economy and financial literacy and strategies on how to teach that. I have put the agenda in the chat. Everything you should need should be on that agenda. And I would like to introduce you, if you don't know her, to Dr. Cynthia Resor. She's fantastic. I love how she always looks at things through a different lens and makes it exciting and new. And so I believe probably most of you do know her, but I'll turn it over to her and we'll get started.
Hey, Kay, be sure and put the whole Google file link.
It's on the agenda.
Okay, good.
So at the top of the agenda, I'm glad you mentioned that. There is a link to a Google folder, and there are some materials that we may reference during the meeting today in that folder. So you may want to open that as well.
So I'm going to turn off my camera just so I don't overload anything. So we're going to talk about the 1950s economy. And not economics per se, but the economy. So I found this lovely turquoise car. Oh my God, I don't want a car that big, but why have they gone to just making cars in like white and gray and black and blah? I want a car that color. But the car industry, of course, was one of the driving industries in the 50s. So I thought that was appropriate. And in part 2 of this, which isn't till Monday, December 12th, we'll look more about how it impacted sort of daily life. So I thought the woman was appropriate there because a woman's role in the 50s was often dramatically different from today. A 1957 Bel Air convertible. So here's the descriptions of the 2 sessions. So today is kind of the nuts and bolts and charts and the hardcore part, and then we'll spread out and see how these different things in life in the 50s related to the economy of the day. As usual, please don't post this on the internet. When we get to the 1950s, images are still under copyright, and I'm sure I've broken some copyright laws. So you can use it with your students in your class, but please don't put it on the internet. The preview quizzes we posted there, and these are just different ones I found on the internet for financial literacy. And like we were saying, some are too hard. They're more for high level investments, and then some are everyday life kind of financial literacy. Which brings us to our essential question. So the big one, the overall one, was the 1950s economy as rosy as our textbooks depict it in all areas and for all Americans, because everything says, oh, everything in the 50s was a boom, and that overall is true, but it didn't boom for everybody, and there were some recessions in the 50s. Like, it wasn't perfect everywhere all the time, but our many essential issue, I'm calling it an issue because I couldn't really make it a question, but when we teach economic issues in the past, I'll admit I had to do the last class I taught at Eastern for about 6 years was economics and world history for elementary teachers. And I think I had one economics class in college. So I had to do a lot of reading. And I'm going to say economics is a discipline that is hard. First of all, a lot of economists are mathematicians, not what I would think of as sort of social scientists. They come up with these theories in these charts. It's just a hard academic discipline to grasp, but yet I had to translate it into meaningful things for my students. And that's where financial literacy came to my rescue. So we would do some of the theories, but then I would try to connect it to some financial literacy lessons that they could use with their students or in their own lives. So when we tackle these economic issues in the past, instead of trying to make it like an economist, or we might try to say, okay, credit cards were invented in the 50s. Let's look at credit cards today and if you should have one. And we'll do that a little bit later. So it's a good bridge to maybe not go into great detail about it in the 50s, but bring it up to today. Because goodness knows, everybody always needs more financial literacy lessons. And, you know, in my, gosh, a billion years in social studies, financial literacy often gets left out. Like, does it go in the home ec class? Well, not everybody takes home economics. You know, do you fit it in economics if you have any in your social studies curriculum? Well, often we're teaching those theories. So it's a hard thing to fit in, but it's something that students will use every day of their lives. So, yeah, the economy was booming. And again, the car industry was one of the biggest ones. In fact, I'm sure, you know, last spring, I think, and this is on the agenda, those related presentations from the spring. You know, I'm sure you all know some Kentuckians that got on the Hillbilly Highway, went north, worked in the car industry, had a great pension, started that in the 50s and 60s and have moved home today. So that was a booming industry, and a lot of Kentuckians moved north to participate in that industry. And in fact, the economy was so productive that every man, woman, and child could have lived at a good level of comfort. Of course, we know that money is hardly ever distributed so that way. Mass unemployment was eliminated. And of course, coming out of the Depression, people remembered that. And so times were good. If you wanted a job, you could find one. And they were pretty good jobs in many cases. You know, factory jobs, unionized factory jobs were pretty good jobs at that time. And I have charts in here, and this book, as you notice, is actually from 1963. And I took pictures of them, so they're not as pretty as I would like. But I love, one thing I do like about economics, the discipline, is you can convey a lot with the chart. So this is the gross national product. Today, it's like the GDP, the gross domestic product. And they, in constant dollars, means they've fixed it so inflation isn't a factor. So we can compare this year to this year without having to worry about inflation and how that would have impacted it. And you'll see, here's the gross national product. It's going up, 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 up. Expenditures, personal consumption, up, 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 up. Look at the goods and services. Of course, this big boom, government spending, is World War II, but you see it's going up too. And a lot of that was military spending. So the chart shows, yep, overall, it was going up. This is unemployment in this era from 47 to 60. But you see that there were some periods in which unemployment grew, right? So there were ups and downs in the economy. And sometimes we forget that, you know, this was a decade, and sometimes there's ups and sometimes downs, just like today. One of the big themes was government spending grew even though we weren't in a depression and we weren't in a global war. And a lot of that was due to military spending. So if you study the 50s, you know, they talk about the vast industrial military complex, and that is where a lot of that spending was going. Here's some advertisements from the 50s. They were in specialty magazines. These wouldn't have run in Ladies' Home Journal, but it shows some of the different types of aircraft that were being pioneered. And here shows a federal in billions of dollars expenditures and national security. Look how much of this was for national security. This is state and local spending, and it was climbing as well. And we'll talk a little bit about why in a minute, but it wasn't national security, right? That's what the feds are spending their money on. I like this picture from Life, this ad from Life magazine. Even though the war was over in 1950, of course, we were getting engaged in the Korean War. So here was an ad, a recruiting ad from Life magazine. Now, inflation, of course, is a huge topic today. right? And you can't turn on the news. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, the news is driving me nuts. I think the inflation story is low-hanging fruit. They don't have to do anything. They just Google prices of things and say inflation, inflation, inflation. And yes, prices are going up, but I think in some ways they've gone up more in our minds than in reality on some things, because they're constantly doing this because it's an easy story to do. But this is an inflation chart that starts here. You can see the line at the 50s and then past 2000. Now, this website is really cool because it's interactive. So you can go through time and you can see down here, you can look at different time periods and you can see when the inflation was really high and then when it was low.
Dr. Resor, is
yeah.
that website linked on the action agenda?
Let's see here. Let me do no, but I can put it in the chat box this way.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and put that on the agenda for
Yeah.
today because you said it's really good.
And I'll put the PowerPoint in the folder afterwards. There you go. If you want to take a look, let me go back to.
Sorry.
That's okay. I thought about that and I thought, well, so you can see here that here's periods when it was prices were growing, and then there were periods when prices were going down. I think these are in the depression here, right? And of course, here we are today. But notice that inflation today wasn't a lot different than the rate of inflation in the 50s. And often inflation is caused by when people want things and they're not available. So think about in the late 40s, early 50s, there was a lot of pent up want, people were starting to make money again. Life was more normal. They wanted to buy these consumer goods, but they may not have always been available. And that had something to do with inflation. And then this big, huge jump is the 70s and 80s. Now, this is cool, this inflation calculator. Let me do this one, because this is I meant to actually put this one in there and I forgot. Open this one because I want you to put something in the inflation calculator. So I did two. So the cost of a new Magnavox TV, right? Oh my God, the cutting edge new TV in 1955. The cost in 1955 was $249.50. That was in an advertisement. And if you put that in the inflation calculator, that would cost $2,774 today. And nobody pays that for most average normal TVs. In fact, the most common price of a new TV in 2022 is $400, $500. In fact, I got a giant 50-inch one at that Walmart Black Friday sale, Walmart Roku 50-inch for $150. So here's a case where over time, TV technology has declined in prices. And that happens, right? It was new technology then, it cost a lot, it's gone down. But look at a median home price in 1955 was $18,290. If we put that in the inflation calculator, that house today would cost a little over 200,000. But look, medium home sale prices right now are double that. But remember, we're in a period where housing prices have gone up, 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 up. And in fact, I just read some story today. I don't know if it's true or not. They say, oh, there's going to be a housing price crash. And as interest rates rise, the housing boom has declined some. So, having students look at an inflation calculator. And, have you had, and I bet every one of you could raise your hand if we were in person, or you can do it on your computer. I bet every one of your students you quoted, like they'll say, oh my God, this just cost $2 then. Well, how much would that be today? Whip out the inflation calculator and say, let's see if the price of this has gone up or down. Like, for instance, I remember my dad, mom were teenagers and young adults in the 50s. And, they say, oh, Coke just cost a nickel. Of course, the thing just had 10 ounces in it. Well, somebody popped that in the inflation calculator for 1955. What would that be today? Has the price of Coke gone up or down if we account for inflation? So it's a pretty neat tool. This one was one I just discovered today. Yeah, and you can do it for different years. So there were some recessions. What caused these recessions? Well, one was there was a period in the late 40s where the post-war consumer spending slowed a little. There was another one right after the Korean War. We had a recession. These were very short, but you know, that graph dipped a little. There was what they called it the Eisenhower recession, but he didn't actually start it, but he was credited for ending it. And a part of it had to do with the Asian flu pandemic, and it cut the supply chain. Now, of course, we weren't buying stuff from Asia like we do today, but still, that's interesting, right? And it was a worldwide downturn, and it was the most significant recession we'd had since World War II. And then there were higher interest rates, because a lot of times when there is high inflation, the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates to slow the economy, and that's what's happened today. So you can make those comparisons. And Eisenhower was credited with ending this one because that's when they started the public infrastructure and highway construction program. So huge chunk of government spending on our infrastructure, which, by the way, hasn't really occurred in that, you know, a lot of our infrastructure hasn't really been updated a lot since then, and it needs to. And you hear these stories about how bridges need fixed and that sort of thing. And then there was another downturn in the very early 1960s. And this one's interesting. It was largely started by a downturn in the auto industry because people started buying smaller foreign cars. And the American auto industry said, oh my God, we're going to have to offer more smaller cars. So they had to design and sort of retool. And it took a little while for them to do that and then get the manufacturing processes back up. But you know, everything wasn't perfect. There's always these dips in the business cycle or in the economy. This shows the recessions again, and it shows new housing starts, which means, you know, we know in the 50s there was a huge housing boom because not many new houses have been built in the Depression. Not many new houses were built during World War II. And most people, the majority of people, rented because we didn't have the handy dandy consumer loan and the veterans GI bills that enabled people to get loans for houses. So we had this huge boom, but you can see that when there was a recession, right, the housing market may or may not have gone up or down. So it's sort of interesting when you look at the things over the decade. There's the gross national product. See, it's going up, but notice there's some dips in the housing market. And notice at the end, you know, they go up sort of towards the end of the recessions. So let's talk about this government spending. Here's a map of the National Interstate and Defense Highway System. This is a map from June 1958. And of course, there's interstates on there now. I mean, we have interstates now that aren't on that map, and you'll notice not all of these were finished, right? Some of these weren't finished. But imagine travel before interstate highway systems. Differences in housing markets for people of color during this time. There certainly were differences. I'm sure there's a chart out there probably for that, but I don't have one. Jonathan asked that question now. But imagine travel without an interstate highway and how much longer it would take. But if you travel state roads today, you drive through sort of ghost towns of old communities, you know, strip motels, businesses that were a part of a thriving state highway system, but were bypassed in an interstate highway. So while we talk about the boom in the 50s of travel and vacations and all these new things that were being built along interstates, it's also the decline of others. So cities were growing, right? Suburbanization and urban sprawl was not a new thing, right? That had started in the industrial era of the late 1800s. People were moving from the country to the city. There was suburbia in those periods, only you got to suburbia by a train instead of a car. They were having to grow the public utilities. So there was growth in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, and up into the 20s. But the kind of suburbia in the 50s, it was a larger scale growth. And American cities are going to change because of that growth. And it was related to residential housing construction that took place in the suburbs, right? Which hollows out people living inside this old city, we'll call it. There's an increase in home ownership rather than renting. There's that growth and rise of prosperity of this middle class, because it's a period where one of the few periods in history where, kind of working class, lower middle class could actually probably get by on the man's salary and the mom could stay at home. And that's been hard to do through most of history. There's a lot of spending on consumer goods. And with that, then there's new stores out in the suburbs. And then there's the supply of water for industry that created a lot of changes. And of course, for homes and public utilities. So cities are changing, they're moving outward. And but as they do that, the cities have to spend because public services cost money, right? First of all, you got to build the roads to get out to the suburbs. And as more people move to the suburbs, you have to make the roads bigger. And Lexington is an evidence of that. If you've lived in Lexington or been going to Lexington over a number of years, I can remember in the 80s, oh God, in 1985, Todd's Road, you drove out in the country on Todd's Road. And now you drive to Hamburg on Todd's Road. And I guess eventually it goes out into the country, but a lot of that side of town was country because I had a friend that lived there. She lived out in the country. And so Lexington has grown out. And they've tried to limit that somewhat, but then other towns don't limit it so much. And then when you grow out, you have to build new roads to it. So for instance, Nicholasville, they've got that big new road for Branna Crossing and they're building that cut through south of Nicholasville. So that costs money. Huge expenditures on new power facilities, on sewage plants, on water systems. Those are all public utilities, on schools. So state and local spending is going to more than double, largely because of this growth. By the way, there's some real good primary sources on this State Museum Pennsylvania website, and that's where I got these images. But as this happens, like I said, the inner cities are declining. And I love this cartoon from 1957. Here's all the people moving to suburbia. And these older metropolitan areas are going to suffer decline, both in commercial business and residential areas. The tax base is going to decline in the older part of the city. And the affluent are going to move to the suburbs, and that's going to leave the poor people, Black people, Hispanic people, and those hillbillies that move up the hillbilly highway from the south. That's going to leave them in the old parts of town where the rent's low. And so we looked at that last spring. There were enclaves of the hillbillies and these poor rundown houses where they could afford the rent. And that's true with different minorities and groups of immigrants as well. And here's what Jonathan mentioned earlier. This is referring to that. Now this goes a little past our time period. Oh, I forgot to put it back on. You all should have said something to me. I forgot to put it back on view. Here's a cartoon that shows, let me adjust it here, from 1971, where a Black man's trying to buy something in suburbia. And he says, I can't keep you out for being Black, but your money might not be great enough. And if there's a real good book about a lady in Louisville, and I knew when I said this, I wouldn't be able to remember her name, Anne. Anyway, her and her husband were accused of being communists. And they were accused of blowing up a house that they purchased for a Black couple who wanted to move in a segregated neighborhood. And starts with a B. Someone help me out here. It'll come to me in a minute. And then here's another 1963 cartoon about resegregation of city schools. In other words, the white people have moved out and the city schools have resegregated. Now, so we've looked at government spending on military by the federal government spending on growth by city, local governments, but what about social services in the 1950s? The Depression was the big era on spending for social services, the things we could lump under welfare. What were we doing in the 50s on that? Well, you could argue, times were good. And so we didn't need to, but times weren't good for everybody. You know, up to a third of people were still living in what was considered poverty then. So spending on social services did plateau during the 50s. And a part of it was the economy was good. So people forgot, they started forgetting the Depression. You know, the older people, the memories mellowed. Younger people didn't have the memories of it. Plus, a lot of this period is people had rising expectations. In other words, your life might not have been perfect, but the economy was good, things were growing, and you had an expectation that things were going to get better. And so when people have that expectation, they don't see the need to spend money on services, especially for the poor, because they would think, oh, well, why don't they just go make something of themselves in this great economy? And that makes sense if you have the money to move, but of course, not everybody does. So when the economy's good, Americans are often less motivated to spend on social services. So this is shows from the 20s up to 2000, social insurance and public assistance programs. And work relief, of course, you see this is the 30s, right? So it's really going up and down then. Things sink during the 40s because of the wars. You see work relief, that just disappears. But then we come back here, public assistance. So here's some examples of public assistance today. Now, not all of these programs existed in the 50s, but these are some examples so that you see the difference between public assistance and then social insurance examples. And you notice the public assistance has gone up some, but the social insurance programs have definitely climbed. So that includes Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, disability insurance. And Medicaid, I think, would fall down here. But then notice that same spending has gone up for private health insurance, private income maintenance, and private welfare. So in other words, this is charitable things or your own private pension plan, right? So big growth, especially in social insurance. So and this was a unique time on social services. And I think this is really, the economy was so good and people were prospering that a lot of the resentments between labor unions or a lot of the battles they had fought, either the battles kind of disappeared, people kind of forgot, I guess we'll call it class warfare or class disagreement. And politically influential Americans said, you know what? It's individual effort that's going to get you ahead. In other words, people were moving towards that equality. Everybody has an opportunity to get a job, go out and get it kind of view. And so most Americans really didn't think there was a need for social services programs. And at this time, politics were largely controlled by these big interest groups. And this was called interest group liberalism. Businessmen, large farmers, physicians, veterans, unionized workers. These were the people that were running politics, and everybody seemed to be okay with it because things were going well. By the early 60s, we had such a positive view about what was coming ahead that we spent tons of money on the 60s on different kinds of government, we'll call them social welfare program, because the pie seemed to be so big. And here's a list. This is just some of the programs by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the early 60s. A lot of these we still have today in some form. They've shifted over time. And if you go to the Wikipedia, there's plenty more. But when the economy crashed in the early 70s, and part of it was due to the oil crisis, and part of it, the oil embargo, and part of it was due to the nature of the economy was shifting, we were proved wrong. So ever seems like in the 80s, the 90s, and then all the way up to today, it seems like there's this constant battle on whether we should spend money on social it's not just welfare, but government programs to help people. I put Sesame Street up there because that was one of the programs funded. PBS was funded in the 60s. And of course, if you're my age, Sesame Street was incredibly influential on your youth. Sadly, it's not even on PBS anymore, is it? Didn't they move it to HBO, which is sad. But the public broadcasting service was founded, along with a lot of other programs in the 60s, because of that economic growth and our positive view of the future. And it was the 70s when things sort of crashed. So here we had the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, things were overall good. And the oil embargo started this crash. So here's the price of oil, and then suddenly, whoa, it goes way up and it comes back down. But you see, because we are so dependent on that energy, it's had a big effect on the economy. Let's look at taxes in the 50s. These are modern cartoons. I like this one. I spend 30% of my day working for the tax man, so that's the part I'll goof off. You all try that tomorrow at work. Here's the ancient Roman with the taxpayers slaving away, but the boat's going to turn over because of the different multinational corporations that's going to turn it over. Here's, of course, an anti-tax cartoon. So here's two charts. And by the way, this one, this one's interactive. Let me put this link in the chat box. It's pretty cool. Yeah, there you go. So here's this first chart is taxes on the wealthy. Now, notice this isn't over time, right? This shows the percentage change of the wealthy versus this is 1950, when the wealthy are paying vastly higher taxes than the middle class. So you see down here across the horizontal line, this is the poor people, right? And they're not paying much. This is the middle class. They're not having to pay a huge amount. But the people with the highest income are paying the highest taxes. This one shows the tax rates over time and the shifts in the income groups. So here's 1950. See right here? That's up here. And the interactive ones, it'll change. And then look at the line today. So the top 400 people in wealth are paying about the same percentage tax as we are. Doesn't that make you feel better? So you're paying, I don't know, 25, 30% tax on your income, and so are the billionaires. So huge change. And of course, this is called a progressive tax system, where as your income goes up, your taxes go up. This is not a progressive. In fact, this line reflects more what's called a flat tax or a regressive tax. And generally in the United States, we followed a progressive tax ideal that the more you make, the more you pay. But if you look at this line, that is not the case. And this hasn't changed a lot since 2018. Here's some charts that show corporate tax. And we say, oh my gosh, how could the government spend all this money in the 50s and 60s on all these programs that benefited all these people? Well, they were taking up a whole lot more money from the corporations and the rich people. So here you see corporate taxes in the 50s and individual taxes. And here's individual taxes today, the blue line, and here's corporate taxes today. So we wonder why the bridges are falling apart. Because corporations aren't paying their share of the pie. Here's corporate income tax revenue by state. So yellow is they don't charge taxes on corporations, and dark blue is they charge more than 4%. So here you can see Kentucky, we charge 0 to 2% as a share of the state and local revenues and corporate income tax. So that's the revenue, not the rate. And then this one, whoops, sorry. This one shows individual taxes from 35 to 2020. And you see they jumped in the 40s and 50s. They've held about the same. Here's the corporate taxes. They've gone down. Here's social insurance and retirement receipts. In other words, what you pay on your paycheck towards Social Security and Medicare. Here's excise taxes, which is basically import-export, right? So interesting. our personal income tax hasn't changed, but a big shift in the others. This is what's called the effective corporate tax rate from 47 to 2011. Effective is what you'll pay, right? Marginal tax amount is what applies to additional levels of income.
Dr. Resor, we have a question in the chat.
50 and now, well, yeah, politics has a lot to do with it. I mean, since the 80s, and of course, I know some of you are conservatives, some of you are liberals, but the conservatives have said smaller government, less taxes, smaller government, less taxes. That's been the popular mantra of the more conservatives group and the Republicans. So it started in the 80s with Reagan, smaller government, less taxes, smaller government, less taxes. And that's continued on. And it's certainly been true for corporate taxes. It's not shifted a lot for, the middle class income taxes. But when people hear over the decades, smaller government, less taxes, in my opinion, they've forgotten what all the things those taxes pay for. And I actually do an activity. I used to do an activity with my students. I say, get out a piece of paper and list everything that your taxes pay for. And then now list all the taxes you pay. And, when you start putting on a list, all the things we get, national security, police, fire, roads, libraries, public schools, just to name a few, somebody has to pay for that. Well, yeah, that's your tax dollar. So that's my opinion. People have heard for too long that you could have it all, but not pay the bill. And if we're going to have these things, we're going to have to pay the bill for them through taxes. So world events also had a huge impact on the economy. Of course, we looked at the Cold War last time, and I have totally lost my clock. Let me pull that back up so I don't go on here forever. Okay, we looked at the Cold War, so let's see what that did to the American economy. But first, imports and exports in the 50s. And then this is another great way you can make comparisons with your students, because again, the political rhetoric is we import too much and we don't export enough. But when you look at actual numbers and what we do export, that's not always the case. Yes, we do import a lot of consumer goods, but we're still exporting a lot of things as well. In the 50s, the United States had about a fifth of the value of the world's exports and about an eighth of the imports. So we were still importing, we were importing things in the 50s. We passed the United Kingdom in the 50s as the largest importing nation. So, we were buying things from other places, even though a lot more things were made in America. Clothing was still made in America in the 50s, but we were still importing a lot of things as well. Our imports were more finished goods in the 50s, and foreign cars were dominating that finished good upsurge until about 1960. And that's when the American car producer says, oh, we need to produce a compact car. And I found these pictures. I'm not a car person, except that I want a turquoise one like this. These are compact cars from 1960, which of course look huge today. But when the American car makers said, we've got to start producing this, remember that was when they retooled and there was a recession there. But here's some of the first models of compact cars in the years they were produced. Plymouth, which of course isn't around anymore. I think I had a boyfriend in high school that drove a Plymouth like that. It was old then. The Falcon, the Corvair, and the Studebaker didn't last too long. In fact, that picture is one in Australia. But here, this is just one chart, but there's all kinds of interactive websites you can find about modern imports and exports. You can look up where our products are coming from, what countries, and then where we are sending products. And of course, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, it's all coming from China. Actually, we import more from Canada and Mexico, but people forget that, right? But we also export a lot to Canada and Mexico. So you can look up all sorts of cool interactive charts. This is just one that shows our imports are worth about 3 trillion and our exports are worth about 2.5 trillion. And of course, here's where you could talk about trade deficits and the advantages and disadvantages of that. But it just shows some of the categories of the things we export and some of the things we import. And notice consumer goods is high on the imports, but we also export some consumer goods. The Soviet Union, large part of the military budget was because of the Cold War. And it wasn't just on, the military and military equipment. It was also huge subsidies to higher education and research and development for industry so we could compete and stay ahead of the Soviets in technology and weaponry. So the US government was spending a ton of money on research and development. And a lot of the products that the consumers ended up getting later had to do with government money spent on research and development in the 50s and 60s. In fact, I think GPS, what we use today, Google Maps, and GPS, the old style that you put on your dash, that was earlier a technology that I think was largely developed because of government research and development grants. Our tariff policy had a lot to do with, tax policy on imports and exports. Of course, we had a lot of foreign aid. The Korean War cost a lot of money, and we were giving a lot of money to underdeveloped nations so they wouldn't be tempted by communism. And we didn't really have any competition from the Soviet bloc until the 60s as far as the market. So a lot of money was spent in different aspects of the Cold War. Our international competition was just really nothing in the late 40s and early 50s. But the Europeans started catching up and the Japanese started catching up as we go through the 50s. Here's a chart I found of Japanese production. Japanese is the dark blue one, and you see it climb steadily, and as well as German production. And then the predecessor of the EU, the European Union that we have today, was the European Economic Community in 1958. So this is a map that shows that this is actually the European Union in 2022, the first countries that joined and then the countries that are joining largely because of Russia's crazy invasion of Ukraine. This is the flag of that early European Economic Community where they agreed to work together as a trade bloc to compete with other parts of the world. And of course, today, the EU, they have one currency and all of that. But this idea started in the 50s. Here's tariff rates. So this is our taxes on imported goods. During the Trump years, he wanted to change a lot of the tariffs. If you remember the news, the bourbon industry was one thing that was threatened by some of the changes in imports and exports. Because when we put a tax on imported goods, what does that other country do? They strike back and they do a tax as well. So, if we're going to tax fancy European cheeses and wines, then they're going to tax our bourbon. And that's what starts a trade war. So you can see tariffs over time, different ones. And you see today, the one main story of this chart is, wow, we don't tax hardly anything on imports and exports today because of the trend toward globalization or free trade. So if we minimize that, then we can have more robust trade with other countries. So that's the big story and why those lines go so low. Oh, I did not know that an African-American female invented the GPS. Was it a part of research and development, or am I totally wrong there? Jonathan? American businesses in an industry. We had
Sorry, I don't know. In Black History Month, I just try to highlight people that aren't the normal, like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King, and she came up as the inventor of GPS.
What would we do without GPS? Oh my gosh, we'd have to read a map, wouldn't we? Gas stations would have to give them away free like the 50s. So 7% of the world's population was in the United States, but we had 42% of the world's income. Half the world's manufacturing output was coming from the United States. We produced 57% of the world's steel, 43% of the world's electricity, 62% of the oil, and 80% of the automobiles in the 50s. And our per capita income in 1949 was $1,450. And that was much higher than the next most prosperous group of nations, who were largely European nations and Canada, and they were between $700 and $900. So when we were compared to the rest of the world, we were doing pretty well. But back to my question there, was everybody prospering? And the answer is no. These are actually the pictures I have here are from the Farm Security Administration's pictures, like Dorothea Lange, who was sent around to document rural and urban poverty to help support Roosevelt's anti-poverty program. Here's one from 1938. Was everybody prospering? Estimates are that, and I've seen this a little different, it probably based on what they consider poor, but 23 to 30% of the citizens in the United States were living in poverty. At that time, that was less than $3,000 a year. 16% of white families, over half of Black families were living below the poverty line. And we didn't even have poverty estimates on Hispanics because we didn't count Hispanic people in government census and counting. Almost 20%, 18% of inner city residents were living below the poverty line, and the poor was concentrated in the South, where 46% of the nation's poverty problem was located. Hence, Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty when he came to visit Kentucky and other poor rural areas. And it was often called invisible poverty. And I think that's also true today. There's a lot of middle class and upper class Americans that don't see the poverty problem. For instance, if you live in prosperous suburbia, you may never see those poor urban people that were left behind in the cities, or you may never see the rural depressed areas of the Appalachian Mountains. And I just threw this in here so you'll remember we talked about the reason that so many Black and white Americans left the rural South well, it started in the 20s, 30s, and especially in the 40s and 50s to better high-paying jobs, both in the North and the West. So we talked about that last spring, and there's the Google Drive folder to that presentation if you weren't there, and you can use those resources as well. And the last section here is about education, because it's so sad that we're talking about history, 70 years ago, and some things never change. According to the 1940 census, only 33% of Americans older than 25 had gone beyond 8th grade. Now, I will say that sometimes they may have wanted to go past 8th grade, but they didn't have transportation to a high school so that they could go, right? Only 25% of the population were high school graduates, and only 5% had went to a four-year college or university. Of course, Black children struggled the most in segregated and poorly financed schools. And the thing is, World War II, things didn't get better in education. In fact, 350,000 teachers left their teaching job because you could make a whole lot more money in the military service, or you could get better paying jobs in factories and the war industry. And advocates of better schools were saying, look at this, teachers aren't making any money. A truck driver, a garbage collector, and a bartender is making more money. And I'm sure that was true, just like today. And the United States was spending a smaller amount of their national income on schools than either Great Britain or the Soviet Union. And it was in 1945 that teacher morale hit an all-time low and strikes were beginning. So I feel like, you know what, we're probably there today. And of course, we're seeing that the stories are just snowballing in the news about how, yep, teacher shortage pretty soon. There's not going to be enough teachers to even babysit your children in those schools, much less teach them anything. This is another series of pictures from Breathitt County, taken by the Farm Security Administration. Now, higher education boomed in the 50s. Because of the GI Bill of Rights. So thousands and thousands, in fact, they estimate that 50% of all of those who served, 7.8 million veterans took advantage of these programs in the GI Bill of Rights. They could get government aided loans to start businesses, and also stipends for veterans who wanted to go to higher education. And so they estimate 2.2 million went to college and millions more went to technical schools and agriculture institutions. 97% of those were male. Of course, a larger amount of GIs were male then than would have been today. And this in turn created a huge boom at colleges and universities. So, you know, the 50s and 60s were boom years at a lot of universities, Eastern Kentucky University included. So, you know, here was a government subsidy originally meant to help veterans, but that money moves out into the private world via building houses, starting businesses, and the booms in higher education, more employment of professors. And I found this picture, and this was actually a series of pictures about Willie Gillis, and you can look the rest of them up. And he started doing these pictures when Willie joined the service. So there's several where he's a GI. And then this is him grown up, and see, he's in college. There's his military stuff and his helmet, but here he's sitting in the window at a university getting his college education. My favorite history professor, I went to Campbellsville College for 2 years. That wasn't a good fit, but my favorite history professor, Mr. Bobby Hines, got his master's degree through the GI Bill. And so that was an example, of a direct, part of my love for history is a direct result of the GI Bill. And part of my love of education is a direct result of Sesame Street. Social spending programs. But K-12 education didn't make a lot of progress. It depended on where you lived. So if you lived in a prosperous area, because education is largely financed by local property taxes, you might have great schools, but just like today, if you live in a less prosperous area, your school may not be as well financed. And so, but by the 70s, more people were graduating from high school and more people were enrolling in college and universities. So there was income inequality during this period. And beginning in the 70s is when this economic growth is going to slow, like I mentioned earlier. And this is when a chart that would show how lower class, middle class, and wealthy classes, the lines would be fairly close on the chart. This is where we start getting more and more differentiation between the richest people, the poorest people. And so if you look at survey data today, the richest top percentages are controlling more and more of the world's income and assets, whereas the poor, middle, and poor are controlling less and less. So briefly at the end, in 47, a lot of people, 33% no running water, 40% no flush toilet, 60% lacked, that should be lacked, not like, central heat, 80% heated by wood and coal rather than electricity. And most people were living in rented houses, and that changes. And then here's another chart of the change over time. So in 50, this is pretty cool. 10%, wait, let's see. This is a number, this percent. In 1950, 26% of homes had a TV. 1959, 90%, wow. Refrigerators, freezers, frozen food. It's frozen food kind of like was invented in the 50s. And I'll talk about that next time. Vacuum cleaners, electric washers, dryers. Oh, wow, look at that. But look, it's still pretty low because people were still hanging their clothes out on the line. And then air conditioning. And again, air conditioning was still pretty low as well. Here's the income gains, the chart I mentioned earlier. So see, it was fairly close. The 50s, 60s, 70s, we get to the 80s, and look how it starts separating. And the last part is about consumer spending, growth, and debt and credit. So 50s, it was hard to get consumer credit. Before the 50s, it was hard to get consumer credit. Credit cards and consumer debt started really in the 50s. And wow, look at this line. We are drowning in debt, consumer debt, as well as student loans and other types of debt today. Of course, mortgages are the biggest part. But remember, before the 50s, it was hard to get a home mortgage. That's why most people rented. So the credit card was started in the 50s. The very first one was a diner's card, started in 1950. And then later, American Express came out with a credit card. And remember back when they took that little thing out and your credit card and ran it over your credit card because your credit card had those, they couldn't put it through the computer. That made me remember it there, sorry. But women couldn't get a credit card in their own name until 1970s with the Fair Credit Opportunity Act. So here's an idea of something you can do. And there's a lot more ideas in the Google folder for this week. These are, again, things I did with college students, but it's where we were doing financial literacy, but we were exploring different economic issues as well. So the last thing I want to do is, are loans worth it? So I would give my students this credit card calculator and an amount. And I would say, okay, pretend like you are going to spend $1,000 on your credit card and you're going to make a minimum payment. And there it is. I just put it in the chat box. And your credit card interest rate is 16% and your minimum payment is $20. So if that is what you do, how much will that $1,000 purchase cost you by the time you pay it off? And it blows their mind when they do it. So you can enter that $1,000 at 16%, and you're going to make a minimum payment of $20 per month. And do I have my next slide? Yeah, your original $1,000 becomes $1,658 when interest is added. And people don't do this, right? So is a credit card worth it? And we talk about when it is and when it isn't. This is the one that I especially like. This is the payday loan calculator. And I'll put this in the chat box, but it's in the PowerPoint. And I'll upload that in just a minute. We see payday loan businesses everywhere. They're regulated by the state. So in some states, they can charge incredibly high interest rates, in some states, not so much. But I asked them to put a $500 payday loan in this loan calculator, and they're going to pay it off in 2 weeks. And payday loans usually have a fee, right? So if the fee was $100 to borrow $500 for 2 weeks, what's your interest rate? What's your APR? Because we learn about what an APR is. Your APR is 521%. That's your annual percentage rate. And so I preach that you never, ever go to a payday loan lender unless you are absolutely, completely desperate. And a lot of people don't realize that, or they are desperate and it's the only place they can get a loan. But those are just two kinds of activities you can do with those handy dandy calculators. There's also student loan calculators. And all of those are on the materials that I put in the ideas folder that you can adapt and use with your students. So the references for this, and my time is almost up, the old book from the 60s, Grand Expectations, and the Rise, and that should be Fall, I'll fix that, of American Growth. And then I put a couple of 1950s maps there just for fun. So I also recommend, if you don't listen to the Freakonomics podcast, this is a really good one. Our personal finance guru's giving you bad advice. And if you just listen to one, Freakonomics, this one's worth it, but they're all good. In this one, they're discussing this divide between economists, who are academics and mathematicians and write articles that make sense to no average person and they can't apply to their financial lives, and advice given by people like Dave Ramsey and Suze Orman. And they talk about how Dave Ramsey might give advice that an economist would agree with, but maybe Dave Ramsey's advice will get people to save money, whereas an economist's advice might not. And it brings in the idea of behavioral economics. So if you just do the math, the chart might say that economists make, you're supposed to do this, but behavioral economics says, yeah, but human brains are sometimes irrational and we do this. So it really helps to describe that divide between the discipline of economics and economics applied in our daily lives, like financial literacy. So I really recommend that episode, but all the Freakonomics are good. And of course, there's the usual things I end up with. So my time's up. Let me close this and I'll show you the Google file here real quick. Oh, yeah, you don't need to see that now. Here's the Google file. I'll put the PowerPoint in there in just a minute. There's our agenda. And then in this folder is some ideas. So for instance, here's the PowerPoint that I used. I would email all these calculators to students. At the beginning, I would say which loan is the cheapest. And then we would explore 15 and 30-year housing loans, credit card debt, payday lenders and that sort of thing. And then an article, and there's probably better ones, but this is one I used about how to prevent identity theft. So ideas that you can adapt. And then when you do economics in the 50s or 60s or 70s, you can go back and forth between past and present. So any questions? Anybody want to throw anything in? I'm not sure. Yeah, with markup on a product. Yeah, but those calculators are just great because you really see how much things cost. And of course, payday loans are donating that stuff so that you'll get, they dig holes you can't get out of. That's what they're best for, because you go back and you can't afford to pay it back. So you have to take another payday loan. Any other questions, ideas, comments? And hopefully everybody will come back Monday, December 12th, and we will continue our exploration of the economy with some of the consumer products and consumer trends and consumerism that occurred. Okay, you're turned off.
I was going to say, thank you, Dr. Resor. I'm going to turn the recording off now.